Alright, I'm just getting this kicked back up to where we left off with blood vessels. We talked about the conduction system. We've gone through how to read an EKG and all the different types of arrhythmias, factors that affect the cardiac cycle, and cardiac output. And here we go. The first new word you're going to learn in part 3 is called an anastomosis. An anastomosis is a connection between blood vessels. Typically, in the human body, when we're talking about an anastomosis, it's when one artery leads to another artery. Now, we haven't got into too much about blood vessels yet, but typically, arteries lead to capillaries, which lead to veins. An anastomosis is when one artery leads to another artery. And so, in this case, an example would be something called the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis is an anastomosis that feeds your brain. In other words, there are two major arteries that feed your brain, and they're connected by what's called an anastomosis of the circle of Willis. And so if one of these blood vessels is blocked, the other blood vessel can shunt the blood also and make sure that your brain stays healthy with the blood flow, in terms of blood flow. So an anastomosis would be a connection between blood vessels to allow for multiple routes, just in case one vessel is blocked or damaged. So let's talk about other blood flow issues, such as blood clots, coronary artery disease, or narrowing of the arteries. They can cause issues like myocardial ischemia. This is when the blood flow in the coronary arteries is partially blocked. A myocardial infarction is a complete blockage of the coronary arteries, and that's what we call a heart attack, or sometimes it's just abbreviated MI, myocardial infarction. Atherosclerosis is an inflammation disease where the fatty materials build up on the walls of our blood vessels. Something called an atherosclerotic plaque, that's a hard word to say, builds up within the blood vessels. And as that plaque builds up, it's going to narrow the diameter of the vessel. And with a narrower diameter or narrower lumen of the vessel, that's going to increase blood pressure within the vessel. Increased blood pressure in the vessel, you're going to get increased resistance, so it's going to be harder for that blood to flow through that area. It could also cause a platelet plug to form, or a thrombus to form. A thrombus, if you recall, is that movable clot that moves throughout the body and could cause a blocked artery or blocked blood flow to a part of your body. So this is kind of an overview of all of our blood vessels. We talked about some big picture stuff just now. As I mentioned before, there's arteries carrying oxygen-rich blood away. We've talked about the pulmonary arteries already, and we've talked about the aorta already. We're about to get into some more specific arteries in our body. Those large arteries break into smaller arteries, and then the smaller arteries break into even smaller ones. And those really small arteries then form something called an arteriole. An arteriole is an almost microscopic vessel, and they branch off into even smaller vessels called capillaries. Capillaries are very, very thin, microscopic vessels. They surround every single cell in our body. This is how diffusion takes place between our tissues and our cardiovascular system. This is that exchange surface. Then those capillaries lead into a structure called a venule. A venule is kind of like an arteriole. They're very, very small, microscopic, but of course they're carrying the blood away from the capillaries toward the heart. The walls are very thin near the capillaries, and then they get thicker and thicker the closer to the veins they become. Compared with arterioles, venules have very large diameters, and their smooth muscle walls are much thinner. Those venules combine into small veins, and those small veins combine into larger veins, and then the large veins combine into the superior and inferior vena cava, which dump right back into that right atria of the heart. This graphic here shows you at any time where the majority of the blood lies. The majority of the blood in your body is within the veins and venules. The veins and venules have very low blood pressure, so the blood is very slow moving through those structures, and so they act as what we call a blood reservoir. Let's talk about some functions of blood. So functions of vessels rather. If you recall, our circulatory system is a closed system, so the blood vessels form that closed system. It's a closed system of tubes transporting blood away from the heart, through to the tissues, and then back to the heart. It's allowing for the exchange of substances between blood and body tissues. At the capillary level, things like nutrients and oxygen are going to diffuse out, and waste products and carbon dioxide are going to diffuse in. Arteries and arterioles are very thick-walled. They have 3 layers of tissue, also known as tunics, that surround the lumen or the opening. They're under control of the autonomic nervous system. We talked about that before, that vasoconstriction and vasodilation, referring to these arteries and arterioles. They're also going to respond to local chemicals such as nitric oxide for smooth muscle contraction. That vasoconstriction is when those arterial walls contract, narrowing the lumen, making it more small. Vasodilation is when those arterial walls relax. That's going to enlarge the lumen, decreasing the blood pressure, allowing more blood to flow through. Vasoconstriction and vasodilation are very important in order to control overall blood pressure as well as blood flow through the body. Here's a diagram showing you those 3 tunics that I mentioned, or 3 layers. You have the inner layer of our arteries, which is called the tunica intima. Tunica intima is made of simple squamous epithelium. So it basically provides a layer for the blood to flow across to reduce friction. It does not undergo much friction at all because it is just a single cell thick, so it's really just there meant to reduce friction between the blood that's flowing through those vessels and the underlying muscles within the tunica media. The tunica media is the middle layer, hence media. This is mostly made of smooth muscle. It's the smooth muscle that's going to control the diameter of the lumen. It's also very elastic, which allows the tunica media to stretch a little bit as the blood pressure lowers and that lumen widens. The tunica externa is that outer wrapping of the arteries, and this is made of mostly elastic and collagen fibers to make them very, very stretchy. If you ever have the opportunity to go to a dissection and feel an artery, you can feel they're very, very rubbery. And that's because of those collagen and elastic fibers. You can see this label here is pointing to the inner lining of that tube, which is also known as the lumen. The lumen is a Latin word for space. So the lumen of the artery is where the blood will flow through. When we get to digestive tract, we'll also refer to the lumen. That's the area where the food passes through. So the lumen is just the space where the substance, in this case blood, passes. The aorta, of course, is the largest artery in the body. It has major branches that are going to go off to the head, the neck, and the trunk, which will then divide off into the lower limbs. There's an ascending aorta. There's an aortic arch. There's a thoracic aorta, which is the part of the descending aorta within the thoracic cavity. And then there's the abdominal aorta, which is the part of the aorta within the abdominal cavity. The ascending aorta has a couple of branches coming off of it, which include the right and left coronary arteries. The right and left coronary arteries give the blood supply to the heart muscle itself. There's also the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk branches off to the right side of your body. It leads to the right common carotid artery, which is going to supply the right side of the head and right side of the neck. It's also going to lead to the right subclavian, which is going to branch into the right brachial artery, which is going to supply the right arm. The other 2 branches of the aorta coming off of that aortic arch include the left common carotid artery, which is going to go up the neck and supply the left part of the head and neck, and then the left subclavian, which is going to go to the left arm. There's some thoracic branches of the aorta as well, bronchial, esophageal, posterior intercostal arteries, as well as the superior phrenic arteries, which are innervating the diaphragm. Your lab instructor will get into more specifics as to exactly which arteries and which branches of the aorta that you need to be familiar with. I'm just reviewing them now for your own review purposes. There's the abdominal aorta, which branches off into the inferior phrenic artery, supplying the underside of your diaphragm. And then there's the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk leads to the common hepatic artery, which is going to the stomach, liver, pancreas, and the first segment of the small intestine, known as the duodenum. Then there's the left gastric artery, which supplies the stomach and the esophagus. And then there's the splenic artery, which supplies the spleen, pancreas, and stomach. There's also the superior mesenteric artery, which is going to the small intestine, cecum, which is the first part of your large intestine, other parts of your colon, and the pancreas, the suprarenal glands or your adrenal glands, and the renal arteries, which supply the kidneys. There's also the gonadal arteries, which are going to supply the testes and ovaries, the inferior mesenteric artery supplying the rectum and parts of the colon, and then the common iliac arteries, which branch off and go down the legs. The arterioles are smaller thick-walled vessels that range in diameter from 15 to 300 micrometers in diameter. They have an endothelial layer, which is 1 to 2 layers of smooth muscle, so they're not quite as muscular as those thicker arteries. The distal end has smooth muscle forming what's called a precapillary sphincter. It's basically a smooth muscle ring controlling the flow of blood into the capillaries. Those precapillary sphincters will open and close at different times, adjusting blood flow at the tissue level. Vasoconstriction and vasodilation is going to occur at this level also to help regulate blood pressure as well as blood flow. Here you can see blood flow controlled by arterioles. You see these precapillary sphincters relaxed in this case, allowing the blood to flow through all of these tissues, collecting through the capillaries and then to the venules. In this case, some of these precapillary sphincters are shunted, which means the blood flow is directed from this arteriole directly through the center capillary and then back into the venule. So in other words, whatever tissue is in this area that the capillary bed is infiltrating, it's not getting supplied at that time. A capillary is a thin-walled microscopic vessel which has just 2 layers, an endothelial layer, which is that simple squamous layer, and a basement membrane. The blood flow is very slow because it's very narrow in diameter. This is going to allow for gas, nutrient waste, as well as other fluid exchange. The fluid exchange is driven by a counterplay between hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. Nutrient-rich fluid is going to move out of the capillary through a process of filtration. Hydrostatic pressure is higher in the capillary. The waste-filled fluid is then returned to the capillary using osmotic pressure. The extra fluid is going to drain into the lymph capillaries, and eventually it's returned into the circulatory system up closer to the heart. Overall blood volume does not change while at the capillary bed. Here you can see that capillary structure, that endothelial layer, and the basement membrane, and you can see in this electron micrograph image that it really is just one cell thick. Only one cell at a time can fit through. Red blood cells are very, very small. The capillary exchange taking place, you see the osmotic pressure is always driving fluids in, hydrostatic pressure is driving fluids out. At the beginning of our capillary, the hydrostatic pressure is very high. At the end or vein side of our capillary, the hydrostatic pressure is low. Osmotic pressure is about the same, moving fluid or gases into the capillary at that point. There's also the lymph vessel within the capillary beds. The lymph vessel is kind of acting like a little vacuum, sucking up any extra fluid that's not taken in to the capillary, and eventually that lymph fluid will return to the circulatory system. Red blood cells at this level are going to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Nutrients are going to diffuse out of the blood and into the interstitial fluid. Wastes are going to diffuse from the cells into the interstitial fluid and into the capillaries. Fluid is going to move out of the capillary at the arterial end, as I mentioned, and the direction of net movement is a balance between that hydrostatic and osmotic pressures. The interstitial fluid is going to drain through those lymph capillaries. The lymph, as we'll look at later, does a job of filtering out any fats or any broken down material. It's kind of like the cleanup crew of our body. Edema is a condition where the interstitial fluid volume increases, and that's when you get swelling as a sign. Causes could be increased hydrostatic pressure, which is going to lead to excessive filtration, or decreased osmotic pressure, leading to inadequate absorption. Ultimately, if it's a lymphatic system issue, leading to the inability to return that excess filtrate back into the circulatory system. So high blood pressure, for instance, would cause edema. With high blood pressure, you have an increased hydrostatic pressure and a decreased osmotic pressure. So that's why one of the signs of high blood pressure is swelling in the limbs or extremities. There is autoregulation of capillary diameter, and that's through local vasodilation and vasoconstriction. There's special chemicals from nearby cells controlling that blood flow, and that's a condition called autoregulation, being able to control the amount of blood flow based on the local conditions of hydrostatic and osmotic pressures. Now that we're through the capillaries, we're getting into the veins and venules. Blood's going to travel from capillaries into the venules and then into the larger veins. Blood pressure is going to drop as the blood transitions into those larger diameter vessels. There's also 3 layers or 3 tunics to the veins. They have very thin walls. They have larger lumens than the arterioles and arteries do. They're more expandable in diameter, and many of them have valves to help prevent backflow of blood. And you may think of those long veins going up your legs. The blood has to flow up your legs to get back to the heart, but there's very low blood pressure in the veins. So there's special valves that only work in one direction to prevent the backflow of that blood back down into your feet. Varicose veins is when gravity is forcing the blood backwards because you have weak valves. The venous blood pressure is going to be increased in individuals that have varicose veins. It's pushing the vein wall outwards. The veins are going to lose their elasticity because of the repeated strain. They'll become flabby and stretched, and they can become very painful in that case. In veins, the blood tends to pool because there's lower pressure. So as we mentioned before, this is the largest blood reservoir in your body. The majority of the blood in your body is within your veins at any given time. And there's contraction of smooth muscle as well as respiratory muscles that ultimately help kind of squeeze that blood back into the heart. Here you can see those 3 tunics, the tunica intima, again, that simple squamous layer to reduce friction. In this case, you have that one-way valve, those venous valves, preventing the flow of blood within that lumen. The tunica media is a very small layer of smooth muscle in this case. There's no elastic lamina. There's no multiple layers of smooth muscle in this case. And the tunica externa is still collagen and elastic to make it tough and stretchy. It's actually the thickest part of the vein. The skeletal muscle pump I alluded to is the idea of those skeletal muscles kind of squeezing and milking that blood back up towards the heart. Gravity is ultimately working to push the blood downwards. So when your leg muscles contract, for instance, gastrocnemius is contracting, it's going to compress the vein and push the blood upwards towards the heart. That contraction leads to those valves more distally to the heart, as well as closing, and then the blood is pushed upwards as well. Right after the muscles relax, the pressure falls in that area, and that causes the valve to close and the heart to close. The valve further away from the heart then opens. Since the blood pressure in the foot is higher than in the leg, the vein's going to fill with blood from the foot. So it just kind of, as I said, just kind of milks its way back up to the heart. And here you see what I was mentioning. The contractions of the heart pump the blood through the entire cardiovascular system. The contractions of the skeletal muscles squeeze those veins to move the blood along. Thereby it's called that skeletal muscle pump. Much like the skeletal muscle pump, the pressure changes in the thoracic and abdominal cavities during breathing also squeeze that blood through, and that's called the respiratory pump. In a relaxed muscle, both the proximal and distal valves are open, allowing that blood to flow upward. When the muscle contracts, that vein gets compressed, so that proximal valve opens and the blood gets squeezed up. The distal valve is going to close, increasing the pressure behind it. And then when the muscle relaxes again, the vein gets compressed. The pressure behind that proximal valve drops, and the valve closes. Increased pressure behind the distal valve opens, and the blood flows back into it. The respiratory pump is based on the idea of alternating compression and decompression of the veins within the thoracic cavity. During inhalation, the diaphragm moves downward. The pressure is then decreased in the abdominal cavity. The abdominal veins are compressed, and the blood moves to the area of low pressure within the thoracic veins, and then ultimately into the right atrium. During exhalation, there's a little bit of backflow into the abdominal veins. The depth of the veins can be very superficial or deep. Arteries are always deep, but veins vary in their depth. The deep veins tend to travel next to the arteries and usually have the same name as the arteries. So let's talk about some of these systemic veins. They drain from the head, the limbs, as well as the trunk The 3 systemic veins returning the deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium include the coronary sinus, which is the major vein of the heart, returning all of the blood flow from the heart muscle, from those coronary arteries. The superior vena cava is draining the head, the neck, the chest, and the upper limbs. And then the inferior vena cava is the largest vein in the body. It's draining the abdomen, the pelvis, and the lower limbs. So coming into that superior vena cava from the head and the neck, you have the right and left internal jugular veins, which are draining the brain, the face, the neck. They're going to unite with the subclavian veins and then ultimately with the brachiocephalic veins and then dump back into the superior vena cava. The right and left external jugular veins drain the scalp as well as superficial and deep regions of the face. They dump into the subclavian, which dump into the brachiocephalic, which dump into the superior vena cava. The vertebral veins drain right into the brachiocephalic, which then go right into the superior vena cava. Those vertebral veins are draining deep structures of the neck, like the cervical vertebrae, cervical spinal cord, and some of the neck muscles. You also have the cephalic veins draining the lateral aspects of the upper limbs. In this case, cephalic is not referring to the head. It's referring to closer to the head, but it's still within the arm. These are veins within the upper arm that drain into the superior vena cava. There's the basilica veins, which drain the medial aspects of the upper limbs. These are connected to the cephalic veins via what's called the median cubital veins. The median cubital veins drain the forearm. The median cubital vein is typically what's used for a venipuncture. When you give blood or when you're getting a blood test done, it's usually that median cubital vein that they're testing for. These cephalic veins merge with the brachial veins and they form the axillary veins. The median antebrachial veins drain the palms and the forearms, and they merge to form the basilica or median cubital veins. Then you also have the radial veins, the ulnar veins, and the brachial veins. The brachial veins are draining the forearm, elbow, and they are going to join with the basilica to form the axillary veins. The ulnar veins drain the medial aspect of the arm, and they join the radial to form the brachial veins. The radial veins drain the lateral aspect of the arm, and they unite with the ulnar to form the brachial veins. The axillary veins drain the arms, the armpit area, the axillae, the upper part of the chest, and they will eventually fuse with the subclavian veins. The subclavian veins drain the arms, the neck, and the thoracic wall. They're continuous with the axillary veins, and they can combine with the internal jugular to form those brachiocephalic veins, where the brachiocephalic veins unite. That's where you have the superior vena cava. And you can kind of see it in this picture. The right and left brachiocephalic right here, with all of their different branches, the jugulars, etc., all of the veins of the arms, all coming into these 2 big branches, draining right here into that superior vena cava, which dump right back into the right atrium. Coming from the legs, you have the largest or longest vein in the body, I should say, the great saphenous veins. They drain the leg, the thigh, the groin, the external genitalia, the abdominal wall, and they empty into the femoral veins. There's a small saphenous vein that drains the foot, the leg, and it empties into the popliteal veins. You also have a right and left posterior tibial vein, which drains the foot, posterior leg muscles. The right and left anterior tibial veins, which drains the ankle, tib-fib joint, anterior portion of the leg. They unite with the posterior tibial veins and form the popliteal veins. The popliteal veins drain the skin, the muscle, and the bones of the knee. And then the femoral veins drain deep structures of the thigh. Let's talk for a minute about pulmonary circulation. We just went through systemic circulation. Pulmonary trunk comes from the right ventricle and carries deoxygenated blood. Then it divides into the right and left pulmonary arteries. We went through this briefly earlier on in the lecture. And then those pulmonary veins carry that oxygenated blood back into the left atrium from the lungs. Here you can see the system. You can see our heart here, right atrium, going to the right ventricle, out through the pulmonary trunk to the right and left pulmonary arteries, to the capillaries of the lungs to pick up lots of oxygen, coming back through those pulmonary veins, which are the only veins in the body to carry oxygenated blood, dumping into the left atrium, going to the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta to wherever in the body they need to go. This diagram here takes all the junk out of the picture, so to speak, and kind of shows you the nitty-gritty. From the right ventricle, you get the pulmonary trunk, right and left pulmonary arteries, to the alveoli within the lungs, to the left pulmonary veins, the left atrium, and then back out to the systemic circuit. There's also a special circulation called the hepatic portal circulation. This is referring to the liver. The liver receives the venous blood from the gastrointestinal tract through a special vein called the hepatic portal vein. Think about it. You're bringing lots and lots of substances into your body via your digestive tract. The job of your liver is to filter and clean anything that's coming into your body, as well as to detoxify any harmful chemicals that are coming into your body via the GI tract. So, before all of those nutrients or possible toxins flow throughout your body and maybe up to your brain, your liver wants to do a little check. Your liver is kind of like the TSA or the security guards of the GI tract, making sure that whatever is being diffused into that GI tract blood is safe for the rest of your body. So it bypasses the rest of the circulation and kind of takes that blood away from the GI tract before it goes up to the heart. The venous blood is very rich in whatever has been absorbed from the GI tract. And the liver is going to process those absorbed substances before allowing them to continue on throughout the body. The liver is also going to get oxygenated blood from the hepatic artery. Within the liver itself, the oxygenated blood is going to mix with the portal venous blood, and all the blood there goes to the general circulation via the hepatic veins. Here you can see that hepatic portal system. You can see all of these veins collecting lots and lots of nutrients from our intestines. In this case, you see the large intestine, but also the small intestine, which has been mostly removed so that you can see the venous structure. Then you can see this large branch here, which is the hepatic portal vein, taking everything first before leading the nutrients into the inferior vena cava, then up to the heart. All of those nutrients go into the hepatic portal vein, which circulate through the liver. Then the liver says, okay, everything looks good, and returns everything back to the inferior vena cava via the hepatic vein. And here you see this pathway down here without all of the junk, so to speak, in the way. All of the tributaries from portions of the stomach, pancreas, large intestine, small intestine, leading to the splenic or superior mesenteric vein, ultimately leading to the hepatic portal vein, which go into the liver. The liver then filters everything, checks everything out, as well as its own circulation from the heart, from the hepatic artery, checks everything out, feeds it into the hepatic veins, into the inferior vena cava, then back to the heart, and then through the systemic circulation. Let's talk about some of the biophysics of blood flow. Ultimately, blood's going to exert pressure on the blood vessel walls. Increase in blood volume is going to ultimately increase blood pressure, as the heart increases blood pressure at the beginning of circulation to create the blood flow through the systemic and pulmonary circulations. Narrowing of those arteries is going to increase resistance and yield a higher pressure. Varying cardiac output is also going to alter the pressure within the vessels. Dilation of arterioles and precapillary sphincters is going to allow fluid to move more quickly to the venous circulation, thus changing the pressure as well. Pressure is ultimately what drives blood flow. Just like when we talked about diffusion osmosis, things will go from areas of high concentration to low concentration. Same thing here. Blood flows from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. There's always some resistance within the blood vessels, even though they're lined with simple squamous. The simple squamous is there to reduce that resistance and reduce the friction, but ultimately, the smaller or more narrow those diameters are, the more pressure there's going to be. So blood flow is a basis or dependent on the change in pressure as well as vascular resistance. So the heart pumping is going to increase the blood pressure. The heart creates that stroke volume of blood, right? That's the amount of blood being pumped out. Within the arteries, the blood pressure is going to change between the systole and diastole. So in other words, your heartbeat actually, or your blood pressure, I should say, actually varies within that cardiac cycle. During a systolic pressure is usually around 120 millimeters of mercury. A diastolic pressure, or resting blood pressure, is usually around 80, which is why they say your blood pressure should be around 120 over 80. Actually, nowadays, they're kind of pushing the 110 over 70 a little bit more, but 120 over 80 is a perfectly normal blood pressure. Mean arterial blood pressure, or MAP, is equal to half of the systolic pressure minus the diastolic pressure plus the diastolic pressure. This is basically an average of the arterial pressure at any given time. Since your heart is resting more than it's contracting, that's why you add that diastolic pressure back in. It takes into account that the heart remains in diastole a little longer than it's in systole. As the blood travels through the narrow passageways, resistance is going to increase, and then the blood pressure drops. Your mean arterial pressure is also dependent on the elasticity of the arteries. So the elasticity of the arteries is going to cause your blood pressure to become more stable. As you get older and more plaques begin to build up on your arteries, they become less elastic, and they also become more narrow, and that's going to ultimately affect your mean arterial pressure. Cardiac output, which is blood flow through the cardiovascular system, that's going to remain consistent overall, but it's going to be influenced by a number of factors that we went over before. Some factors that influence blood pressure include increased force of contraction, which we call contractility, and that's all based upon input from epinephrine and norepinephrine from our adrenal glands, which can increase the contractility. There's also increase in blood volume. Increase in blood volume is going to increase stroke volume, and an increased stroke volume is ultimately going to increase blood pressure. There's also increased cardiac output. Cardiac output is equal to the venous return, how much blood is coming back to the heart. That's going to increase the return. You're going to increase your blood pressure. Increased vascular resistance is going to prevent blood from moving into the capillaries. It's going to try to slow everything down. There's going to be more blood found in the arteries, which is going to increase your overall blood pressure. This diagram here goes through the various factors that influence blood pressure. We'll go through them again. Ultimately, what your heart does is take in a small volume of blood during diastole. The blood's just trickling in. That's that atrium-ventricular filling. Just fills in, trickles in a little bit, applying a force of the contraction to the blood is going to raise the pressure during systole, and then releasing the blood into the systemic circulation through that aorta. As the blood flows through the system, it's in a constant steady state. There's a change in pressure that's going to drive the flow. Remember, anything's going to flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So anything that increases blood pressure is also going to increase blood flow. Vascular resistance is the antithesis of blood flow, so it's going to impede blood flow. R is inversely proportional to flow. For example, if R is increased, then flow is decreased. Here you see a nice little graphic showing you that idea of mean arterial pressure, that map of 120/80 or so. You see the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure kind of averaging out here to be around 80, which is a pretty good mean arterial pressure. This is because your elastic arteries have very low resistance, so the systolic and diastolic pressure are pretty much maintained. The arterioles and capillaries have, as your blood flows through those arterioles, capillaries, and venules, it's much more narrow, so there's an increased resistance. So blood pressure is going to drop because there's decreased blood flow through those areas. In the veins, the veins have a very low resistance because they have such large diameters, so blood pressure is going to drop markedly within the veins, and as well as the vena cava. So that's why you see this kind of cliff here after the blood flows through the arterioles. Let's talk about how blood pressure is regulated. Of course, you should remember that's the main job of the medulla oblongata. That's housing our cardiac center, the vasomotor center. Those centers are going to integrate input as well as send signals through the vagus nerve through parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation. It's also going to control the vasomotor nerves through sympathetic innervation, which are going to cause vasoconstriction to our blood vessels. Those areas of our medulla oblongata are receiving input from several areas, including baroreceptors within the carotid arteries, as well as within the aorta and the right atrium. They're going to sense that stretch of the artery walls due to high blood pressure, and so they will adjust the heart rate accordingly. Frequency of nerve impulses to those centers is going to be proportional to the pressure within the vessels. So as the pressure within the vessels increases, the frequency of nerve impulses increase, and so the frequency of your heart rate is going to increase as well. There's also proprioceptors, which are going to sense movements in the limbs and joints, which is going to provide information to your medulla oblongata. You don't need to have as high of blood pressure when you're sitting or lying down because there's not as much force of gravity. But when you stand up, your medulla oblongata has to sense that and kind of speed up your heart rate and speed up your cardiac output to increase your blood pressure so that you do not fall over. That's why sometimes if you're nice and relaxed and then all of a sudden you jump up, you kind of black out and get a little shaky there for a minute, and that's because your blood pressure just hasn't caught up with the rest of your body just quite yet. There's also special chemoreceptors within the carotid and aortic bodies that are sensing things like pH as well as respiratory gas levels like carbon dioxide and oxygen, and they're going to adjust heart rate and respiration rate accordingly as well. There's also higher centers in the brain that are going to help to regulate blood pressure. Certain areas of your cerebral cortex as well as your limbic system and your hypothalamus are going to play a role in that. They're ultimately integrating information from sensory neurons. Then they're going to send commands to the cardiac and vasomotor centers of the medulla oblongata. This diagram here shows you how it's all interconnected. So let's start at the top. With an increase in blood volume, your skeletal muscle pump, your respiratory pump, and constriction of the veins, you're going to get an increased venous return. With an increased venous return, you're going to get an increased stroke volume, right? Increased venous return, increased stroke volume. Ultimately, that's going to increase your cardiac output. You can also get an increased sympathetic impulses from hormones of the adrenal medulla, the epinephrine and norepinephrine. That is going to lead to increased heart rate as well as increased stroke volume. That's kind of like sympathetic innervation there. With sympathetic innervation, you're going to get a decreased parasympathetic innervation. That's also going to cause increased heart rate and increased stroke volume. So ultimately, that's going to increase your cardiac output. You could have an increased number of red blood cells, like in thalassemia. That's going to lead to an increased blood viscosity or thicker blood. That's going to lead to higher resistance. That higher resistance is going to reduce cardiac output. An increased body size, like in obesity, that's going to lead to a total increase in blood vessel length in your body, which is also going to increase resistance. You can also have a decreased blood vessel radius, vasoconstriction, because of high blood pressure. That's going to cause increased vascular resistance. Ultimately, cardiac output and vascular resistance balance each other out in what we call that mean arterial pressure, or MAP. Let's talk about some reflexes here. There's a baroreceptor reflex. This is one that's regulated by our central nervous system. This is what I was alluding to before. When there's a drop in pressure due to gravity, for example, blood pressure is restored by increasing the heart rate, increasing contractility, increasing blood pressure within the time span of one or two heartbeats. This is going to prevent fainting after standing up, as well as to help maintain your blood pressure after exercise, during exercise, or during extreme blood loss. Your blood pressure is also controlled by hormones, such as antidiuretic hormone. If you recall back to our endocrine chapter, antidiuretic hormone is going to increase blood volume through reabsorption of water within the kidney. Aldosterone is going to do the same thing, except it's going to reabsorb sodium and water in the kidney. Water always follows salt. There's also vasoconstrictors that can increase blood pressure. Those are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and angiotensin II. There's also ANP, the atrionatriuretic hormone. There's also BNP, which is another one your book doesn't mention. Those are secreted by the heart. They're going to cause vasodilation to do the reverse of what the epinephrine, aldosterone, and angiotensin do. They're going to lower the blood pressure, reduce blood volume, to help balance everything out. Exercise has a huge role in blood pressure as well. Working the muscles is going to secrete metabolites to increase vasodilation. Ultimately, vasodilation is going to decrease resistance to decrease blood pressure. There's also special baroreceptors within the heart that are going to decrease blood pressure through vasodilation and sending special messages to the medulla. Higher centers of the brain are going to stimulate the autonomic nervous system, including the cardiovascular center within the medulla. There's also the sympathetic nervous system, which has increased sympathetic outflow to the cardiac accelerator nerve, increasing the heart rate as well as contractility. Sympathetic outflow is then going to increase to the medulla, or to the adrenal medulla, and to the vasomotor nerves, which supply the blood vessels to either dilate or constrict. Then an increased response to sympathetic outflow. Your adrenal glands then going to secrete more epinephrine, which is going to cause vasoconstriction. That vasoconstriction, which is caused by the increased vasomotor nerve activity, increased epinephrine, etc., is going to cause a sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Increased resistance in the arteries and arterioles, as well as the diversion of blood flow from the digestive tract to the skin and the working muscles. So in other words, it's going to help to balance everything out. Ultimately, the results are having an increased cardiac output, increased heart rate, increased blood volume. The blood flow to working muscles is increased dramatically. Blood pressure is going to remain the same or maybe slightly elevated, but it's not going to go off the charts. Let's talk about when it does go off the charts. That's called hypertension. Hypertension is chronic high blood pressure. This can be caused by heart disease. It can be caused by obesity. It can also just be caused by genetic factors. You're just genetically predisposed to have high blood pressure. There's also kidney disease that can play a role in high blood pressure. Treatments include just simple lifestyle changes, eating less salt in your diet, increasing water intake, etc., as well as special medications that can help your body reduce its blood pressure. There's serious consequences if hypertension remains untreated, including a heart attack, heart failure, stroke, glaucoma, which can cause blindness, as well as kidney failure. And that concludes Chapter 11.